last year, and we talk a little bit about sort of the development of that collection. And use it as a way to sort of talk about, I think I'm still trying to ask myself sort of what are we talking about when we talk about diaspora and modern Hebrew literature, and what sort of words we're using for it. And I find sometimes translation to be really useful because it helps you sort of continue to problematize it. When you're translating, you sort of realize just the very many ways you can translate a term into English or another language. And then you sort of realize how much is actually contained within a word. And Sidra talked a bit also about sort of the way metaphor functions as a way of sort of containing, but also sort of problematizing sort of our relationship to place. With respect to sort of how Amichai uses Jerusalem as both a place but also as a metaphor. And I'll be talking a little bit about simile in relation to Vaan's work, and particularly how I think of her relation to particular places, whether it's Israel or other places, in terms of simile. So anyway, those are just some comments that I'll use to preface it. So in keeping with Yaron's instructions, I'm going to talk about one specific text. What I'm hoping is that afterwards, rather than sort of do the sort of standard Q&A where you all throw questions at me and I pretend to be a genius and answer them, so we can sort of also try to read the poem together. And I realize that sometimes with contemporary literature, this can be a little daunting because we don't have this sort of full scholarly apparatus to sort of guide us through it the way we do with other writers.
We also have the poet in the room.
But we also have the poet in the room, but I also know, having spent a lot of time with contemporary poets, know that they don't always want to sort of explain their work, but hopefully Vaan would be able to, if you have questions for her, to answer them. Although I think she's also interested in sort of how we read her work, and the very many different ways we can read it. All right, so I'll begin. So the poet Vaan Nguyen broke into print in the year 2005, which, as some of you know, was sort of a banner year for Israeli literature. A number of new journals came out that year. The journal Kol, Vaan, and others. Some are no longer around, some have persisted, but I think of it as a kind of important year for contemporary literature as I read it. So she broke into print in the journal Nguyen, which featured several of her poems in its second issue. And through its publishing imprint, in 2008, she published a digital and print chapbook titled Nguyen, the Truffle, which was then reissued in 2013 in a sort of revised, expanded book edition, which Vaan has in her hands, and it was under the same title. The Truffle opens, or Nguyen opens with a poem that I pre-circulated, Mekong River, which takes its name from the transboundary river that runs through China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The relation that this title bears to Nguyen's Vietnamese-Israeli cultural background is evident, but the rest of the poem, I contend, plays with and even undermines this relation. So Vaan will read the first stanza in Hebrew.
הלילה חלפתי על 3 מיטות, כמו שתי במקום ולחשתי את יפי הפרת והחידקל. מתחת רגע התמיד, מחפשת, מתחת לציץ השמאלי יש לי חור, ואתה ממלא אותו בגברים אחרים, ריח של בירה טייגר על גופך.
So I'm going to read it in a translation that will be published soon in the literary journal Gulf Coast Magazine. And I mention this because mine's not an academic translation, and what I mean is that I'm not trying to sort of offer you some sort of literal version that plays it safe with the meanings. This is sort of the version that I published where I take certain liberties with the translation, meaning with Vaan's Hebrew. So this is my translation of the first stanza. Tonight I moved between 3 beds like I was sailing on a Mekong. I whispered the beauty of the Tigris and Euphrates. Under an endless moment, looking under the left tit, I have a hole, and you fill it with other men. Notes of tiger beer on your body. So the suggestive image of the 3 beds in the poem's opening may signal the speaker's ongoing displacement, particularly when read in the context of the author's cultural background. As Nguyen's collection unfolds, this line also resonates as shorthand, I argue, for 21st century Israeli travel, a persistent theme of the collection. In Vaan's poems, travel is not always transformative or instigated by a feeling of dislocation. Rather, the speakers of her poems move between various cities in Europe, Asia, and North America as though they form part of a personal map. The Mekong River, in that respect, is both the location of the speaker and a simile for the kind of movement that the speaker claims. According to the critic Menachem Ben, who penned an effusive review of Nguyen's chapbook in 2008, under the title
Everything it has is a little proper map. It's great to think.
There's more about this in an article that I'm publishing on Vaan's work, but I'll leave it at that for now. According to Ben, the mere mention of the Mekong, Tigris, and Euphrates is indicative of Nguyen's foreign idiom, as he put it. Their movements, he implies, are exotic, and he uses that word, which disregards how Mekong River as a whole, and Nguyen's work as a whole, thematizes Israeli travel in particular. Arguably, the heterogeneous cultural and linguistic affiliations that Nguyen brings to her Hebrew poetry are standard in today's multilingual and multicultural Israeli society, particularly in the cosmopolitan milieu of Tel Aviv, where Nguyen locates several of her poems. In the Truffle poems, Nguyen may move between Hollywood, Manhattan, Tel Aviv, Herzliya, Yerushalayim, Belize, Amsterdam, and cities in Vietnam, of course. But these global flows are true for a lot of contemporary Israeli poetry. So what makes Nguyen's movements different or notable? Ben's enthusiastic reception is problematic in that it casts these affiliations as exceptional and exotic in Nguyen's case because of her non-Jewish Vietnamese Israeli cultural background. And he ascribes an exotic currency to her references to other locations, especially Vietnam, in light of her cultural heritage. And they may very well carry a different charge. After all, Nguyen's experience in Vietnam differs from that of other Israeli travelers in that she grew up speaking Vietnamese, or in an environment where people were speaking Vietnamese as a non-Jew in a Jewish state, and to immigrant parents still emotionally and materially attached to memories of their native home. But growing up bilingual or multilingual to non-Jewish parents with the, as I put it, kind of the ke'ev shel shtei hamoledot, is a common ground that Nguyen and her family share with many other Israelis. So in her incisive review of Nguyen's chapbook, the poet Tali, did she pronounce her last name?
Latovitsky.
Tali Latovitsky, and actually this was written on her blog. Another tangent is how most of the criticism surrounding the chapbook actually appeared on people's blogs, and just a few at sort of mainstream editions. And that's something else that interests me, sort of where criticism is happening these days with contemporary literature. Anyway, the poet Tali Latovitsky very aptly observed, this poetry succeeds in being a local poetry wherever it wanders. Latovitsky's observation brings me to the title of my presentation and this phrase, birds of travel, which I've transported and translated from Leah Goldberg's well-known poem, Moller, which is published in her 1955 collection, Balat Baboke. In Goldberg's poem, the speaker inquires whether or not Sipurei Masa, hovering between earth and sky, understand the proverbial ke'ev shel shtei hamoledot, the pain of the two homelands. And whereas migrating birds move between two oppositional poles, the birds of travel, Sipurei Masa, exist in a state of constant movement and suspension between places. The Tigris and Euphrates, like the Mekong, are also rivers that today flow through various national borders and carry significant cultural and historical baggage. Indeed, the area between them, as you know, is the location of ancient Mesopotamia. But more importantly, by invoking the Tigris and Euphrates, which form a river system in Western Asia alongside the Mekong River, the speaker of the poem brings two very distinct and otherwise separate cultural systems into relation. So according to Jewish tradition, Abraham hailed from Ur, a major Mesopotamian city, and Nguyen's reference to these rivers may also constitute, as Maya noted, a possible intertextual relation to Chaim Nachman Bialik's poem, Ve'necha Plat Unecha Chidekel, which is a poem that draws from Jewish folklore and formed part of his series of folk poems that he published in the early 20th century, as you know. In Bialik's poem, a young woman requests in vain the matchmaking skills of a golden hupo. Hupi or hupo? Duchifat Zahav, but I've never said the name in English. which is a mythical bird of the Jewish folk tradition.
It's not mythical.
No.
No.
There's also who goes in Jerusalem.
It is represented as a mythical bird in the Jewish folk tradition, but as of 2008, it is also the national bird of Israel. Don't worry, I am sort of anticipating you a little bit here. And in Nguyen's poem, the speaker is on the Mekong, but she's whispering, that is relating, the beauty of the Tigris and Euphrates. In this act of narration, she brings these systems together. But talking about a lover while you're in bed with another could be an indication that you have placed your affections elsewhere, at least in my reading of the poem. And in the context of reconciling Vietnamese and Israeli identities, this possibility is particularly suggestive, and one that I wish to discuss further with you. But moving on to the second stanza, we find now the following set of images and locations. I'll try to scroll down.
בבדידות יש רעש צרצרים מדרום ללאוס, ממטרות של אוויר קר מהנוי, אגף מתנשף, הישבן מהודק, כתם דיו על הבטן. צייר לי תרשים זרימה בצבע אחיד על פרחים טריים באגרטל, אשביך למרגלותיך שורשים, רוצה לגמור להקיא גרגרי אבק בערבתי, הנחת ידך בתוך תחתוניי, תהיה אישי, מי מעז לעזוב מחלה באמצע ים.
Showers of cold air from Hanoi, the back gasps, the tide asks, an ink stain on the belly. Sketch me a monochrome flow chart on fresh potted flowers. I'll release roots at your feet. I want to come to puke specks of dust in my crotch. Rest your hand in my pants. Make it personal. Who abandons an illness in open sea? Yes, I know that's not exactly a literal translation. I'm happy to talk about my choices.
אם מדברים על התרגום, איך מתרגם קודם את המילה ציץ?
Tit.
אני לא יודע, את יודעת מה זה ציץ במקורות?
ציצית כאילו?
לא ציצי.
אז מה?
זה הציץ של הכהן הגדול, אז אני שואלת כמה השירה שלה יש בה את המקורות האלה.
So by definition, a flowchart is a diagram that represents a process. Each step is contained in a box and is connected to other steps by an arrow. That's how it's generally visualized. So divergences are carefully plotted so that all possibilities are taken into consideration. The potted plants and flowers are also ubiquitous during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, one of the most important days in the Vietnamese calendar, suggesting that an imposition of this flow chart represents a Western fixation with order. But how can you sketch on fresh potted flowers without causing considerable damage? If the lover can connect the dots, meaning the images in this poem, perhaps, or the speaker's baggage, she promises to release roots at your feet. But how do we reconcile this cause and effect with the inevitable damage that results from imposing a kind of homogenizing order to things to this kind of poem? Although the speaker herself desires this order, she's asking for it in effect, Nguyen's poem undermines this controlled flow of activity and information by applying the techniques of collage, particularly in his rejection, collage's rejection of coherence as part of embodied poetics of travel. By redirecting through her speaker's movement the flows of the Mekong, Tigris, and Euphrates, Nguyen offers an alternative and personal map where they are brought into contact. One could even read the two stanzas into which the poem divides as visual representations of two seemingly disparate flows coming together. The line ink stain on the belly may be a sign that the damage of order and organization has been done and is irrevocable, or that the speaker has preempted the desire, even her own desire for order, by writing this indelible movement on her own body. And this is why I refer to the embodied poetics of travel. The closing line of the poem, "Who dares abandon an illness in open sea," not only invokes the history of Israel's Vietnamese refugees, but also raises the ethical considerations that brought these cultures into contact. Considerations that this past week's protests in Tel Aviv make clear are still germane in contemporary debates on the status of non-Jewish refugees and migrant workers in Israel, and in the feeling that Ethiopian Jews have been voicing this week that the Israeli state apparatus privileges only a certain kind of Israeli identity. Nguyen's Hebrew should translate literally as